That's right. The sun has now fallen and the shadows have grown long and tall. Now we gather together to speak of all things strange and odd in our beautiful Greaves County. I'm your host, Arthur Elwood, here to take your stories and eyewitness accounts for the evening. So don't touch that dial, stay a while for tonight's episode of Dark Talk FM. Sounds in the dark, figures in abandoned hallways, chills down your spine and hairs raising on the back of your neck. These telltale signs are of something otherworldly coming near. These are the things most people wouldn't otherwise think about during their everyday lives. However, they are always with us, just on the other side of the veil. What happens when we die? Where do we go when we shed our mortal coil? These unanswerable questions have haunted us since mankind began, just like our subject for tonight's broadcast. That's right, folks. Tonight, we're talking about ghosts and hauntings. Our beloved Greaves County is chock full of history and stories dating back as far as the Revolutionary War period and even further. The land was settled here around the early 1600s, and being that it's such old land, it's no surprise that there have been frequent sightings of strange figures in the dark. They're one minute and gone the next. I myself have seen some things that I just can't easily explain, but that's for another night. This evening, we're starting off with a submission by Mrs. Abigail M. from Safeshire. She sent us her experience last week, and it was so incredible, we had to feature it on tonight's broadcast. So sit back and relax while we delve into Abigail's tale. Abigail writes in, my husband and I moved here to the town of Safeshire almost 10 years ago. Our house sits on a remote piece of land that isn't very far from the old school that burned down 2 winters ago. We enjoyed our time in Safeshire because of how pleasant and quiet it was. Before this, we lived in New York City for a time and grew tired of the hustle and bustle, so it was a very nice change of pace to move here. Most days, my husband Charles would go off to work around 7, and I would get up and tend to the house or work in my little garden out front. In the mornings, I would see the school bus drive by, carrying kids off to their school day. If I was outside, I would always wave as it drove past, and sometimes the kids would wave back. It was always a nice start for my day. I'll never forget the last time that I saw that bus, just before that tragic accident. Well, that was the second to last time, actually. Of course, like everyone at that time, we had heard about the school and the fires. No one ever found out what really caused it, but thankfully, Most of the people had escaped unharmed. Unfortunately, a few kids had been tragically left behind and passed away. That evening, we were glued to our television set, watching the news, and after a while, we eventually turned it off and went up to bed. I was still very uneasy and couldn't get to sleep. Around midnight, after tossing and turning, I got up and walked down to our kitchen to get some water. We have big windows overlooking the front lawn, and I noticed the moonlight was very bright that night. Suddenly, I noticed a large shape in the dark on the street in front of our house. After looking at it for a while, I realized that it was the same school bus that I would see every morning taking the kids to that school. This was very odd, not just because of what had happened, but I'd never seen that bus except for in the mornings, like I'd mentioned. I stood there, glued to the floor, staring at this thing sitting there in the dark. A few moments later, the headlights flashed on and off, and the automated door on the side slowly opened. I couldn't see anyone inside, so this certainly baffled me. Maybe someone had left it unattended and it malfunctioned. I didn't want to wake up Charles because he was working early the next morning, so I decided to get a closer look and went to our front door. But after opening it and looking out over our yard, I saw that the bus had vanished. I knew what I saw, but it was nowhere to be seen. There was no way it could have driven away in that amount of time, and I would have heard the engine starting up anyway. It was all very strange, but I chalked it up to just being tired. I closed the door and went back to bed. However, this was just the beginning. Over the course of the next month, Charles and I would start to notice strange things. Every so often, we'd faintly smell smoke, almost like a campfire was nearby. We'd then hear sounds coming from outside the house, always around midnight. It started slowly, with the sound of footsteps and crunching grass near our bedroom window. If the moon was out, we'd see shadows of small figures dart across the walls. Then the voices and giggling started. It sounded like small children were playing out in our yard in the dark. And what made this so strange was the fact that we had specifically moved to this house because of how out of the way it is, how quiet and peaceful it always was. We knew that no families lived close enough to walk here, and certainly no kids would be out at night. In fact, every time we went outside to look, there'd be no one there, and all would be silent again. As this went on, we started to lose sleep, and I would get more and more anxious. The voices would slowly get louder each night, until eventually, it would sound like people were talking just outside our bedroom window. It really started to take a toll on us. This all culminated in one night, when we heard the same voices and sounds like usual. But then there started to be loud banging sounds on our walls. It sounded like fists were just hitting our house, and the sounds would reverberate and almost shake the house. We called the police immediately, and after 30 minutes or so, a deputy showed up. The banging and voices had died down by then, and he looked around our property, not being able to find anything untoward. He suggested we should try and get back to sleep, and if it happened again, we could file a report. We were shaken because we knew what we had heard, but there was nothing to really do. We went back to bed and tried to sleep. I somehow nodded off after a while, but woke up a few hours later. I sat up in bed and realized that Charles wasn't asleep next to me. He'd gotten out of bed already. I looked at the clock, and it was only around 3 in the morning. This was alarming considering what had just happened, so I quickly got up and looked around for him in the house. As I walked past our living room, I saw him through the front window. He was laying still on the grass outside. Fearing the worst, I rushed outside to find him in a daze. He was mumbling to himself about the children and how angry they were. I noticed he was covered in scratches and bruises. He was mumbling something about how the kids had warned him the bad man was coming. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. Somehow, I got him back inside and called the police again, but of course, they couldn't provide any answers. Safe to say, this was terrifying and was the last straw for me. I knew that we had to leave them, otherwise we'd never find peace. We've since moved houses, leaving the terror behind, and haven't had any experiences like this since. To this day, I still believe that it may have been the spirits of those poor children who lost their lives in the school fire, or maybe something more sinister. Maybe they recognized our house as they saw it every day on their way to school. Either way, I hope they found peace. Abigail. Wow, Abigail. That was a great story. Thanks for sharing with us. We here at Dark Talk are glad that moving houses has seemed to stave off the paranormal disturbances. Of course, we are aware of that terrible fire that happened in Safeshire years back. It's still a mystery what caused it. Perhaps it really was those kids who were visiting you in Charles's house and playing around in your yard. Who knows? Laughter and voices isn't too bad, but banging on the walls and physical attacks are a little much. It's always terrifying to have a place you call home, a safe sanctuary, attacked with the supernatural. No one can deny that. However, when you're alone, traveling through a strange, lonely place, perhaps it becomes almost an expectation to run at some point into something odd and unfamiliar. Our next story comes from a man named Rich. What he told us sent chills up our spine, and we knew we had to share it with our audience. Hey there, Arthur. My name is Rich, and I'm a big fan of DarkTalkFM. I wanted to share my story with you all because I still can't really explain it. I'm a courier for the post office, and I would usually take the late shift, being that I'm kind of a night owl. This would mean that usually around 10 or 11, I'd load up my truck with whatever parcels needed to go to the next town over and head off on the interstate. The thing I liked about this job was that there was never any traffic, and I could listen to whatever I wanted as I made my way down the lonely road. Every night it'd be the same thing, just driving along, me in the road, and maybe some radio to break the silence. It'd be really rare to even see another car driving by, so I got used to the loneliness. It was almost meditative for me. Anyway, I loaded up that night around 11 for dispatch and turned onto the highway heading toward New Spell. Usually this is about an hour's drive to get there, so I settled in for the trek. After about 20 minutes, I was deep in the country. This road winded through the Lockleaf Woods between the towns, and there weren't lights besides my own headlights. Every now and again you might see a deer or rabbit on the road, so you had to be reasonably vigilant to make sure not to hit anything. driving along and suddenly my radio went to static. I'd actually just bought a new one, so I was pretty frustrated. It gave me an eerie feeling, being in the middle of nowhere with just the white noise blaring. So I ended up turning it off. I drove for another 5 minutes or so in the silence when I saw it. There, in the center of the road, was a figure. It was human-shaped, but looked hunched over and was wearing some type of cloak or blanket over itself. Since it was in the middle of the road, I slowed down and then stopped, with my headlights shining on this person. I sat there for a moment and it didn't move, so I slowly rolled down my window and shouted out to them if they needed any help. This was pretty far from civilization, and I wondered that maybe they were a camper that had gotten lost. There was no response, so putting my car in park, I leaned out my window and shouted at the figure again. I wanted to know if they needed some help or were lost. And very slowly, the figure turned around towards me. I would say it looked like an old man, with long gray hair draped over his face, but there was something almost inhuman about him. He slowly slumped over to my car, limping like he was injured, and I was worried I'd have to take him to the nearby hospital. However, once he was alongside my car, near my open window, my blood ran cold. I saw that instead of eyes, there were holes filled with a milky red substance. Staring at me, he moaned with a hoarse, scratchy voice, and I saw the heat from his mouth escape into the cold night air. The sound of it still haunts me. It reverberated through my bones. I was truly scared. My heart was pounding in my chest as the man just stood there, glaring at me through dead eyes, moaning and almost foaming at the mouth, making a disgusting, gurgling sound. I somehow snapped out of my paralysis, and fumbling to shift my car back into drive to get out of there, I peered away for a moment. But when I looked back up, the man was gone. Just gone. I still don't understand it. The shock of that almost made my fear fade for a moment. Looking around, I only saw the quiet woods around me, and the road stretching behind and forward. I even opened my car door and looked around to make sure the man hadn't snuck around the side or was hiding beneath. Just nothing. Like he was never there. Realizing this, I quickly got back into my car and sped off. My hands were trembling, holding the wheel as it took me another half hour to finally get out of those menacing woods. Safe to say, I took the long way home and avoided that path altogether. I also started looking for a new line of work since then. I have no desire to ever venture back into those lockleaf woods, either to see that thing or whatever else is hiding in the shadows. Rich. Wow, Rich. That's terrifying. We've actually had many submissions concerning the lockleaf woods, so much so that we're thinking about maybe doing a whole show dedicated to it. Considering it covers so much land and is pretty central to Greaves County, it's not surprising lots of people have had experiences there. And that's it for tonight's broadcast, folks. We hope you've enjoyed this brief dip of the toe into the murky waters of our great Greaves County. Won't you join us again for the next episode of Dark Talk FM?